Well, President Cyril Ramaphosa will join other heads of state at the summit for the new Global Financing PACT. That's in the French capital, Paris, today. The two-day summit is being hosted by the French President Emmanuel Macron. Over 300 delegates are gathering to lay the groundwork for a renewed financial system that's suited to the common challenges of the 21st century, including fighting inequalities and climate change, as well as protecting biodiversity. For more on this, we're joined by SABC News correspondent Cullen in Paris once again. Ross, good morning to you once again. I think a little bit earlier when we spoke, you did mention that the South African president had already touched down and that we're getting closer and closer to really seeing proceedings take off. And I think maybe start off with talking to us about where we are right now in that sort of program or the lead up to the program. But I'm really quite keen to hear what the discussions are of where the just energy transition here in South Africa is going to obviously be a topical issue, particularly where the focus for South Africa lately has been in interactions with Europe around green hydrogen.
Yeah, good morning. The President of France has opened this summit, well now underway. President Macron, the lead speaker, and then we had different other speakers as well in that opening segment, including a Ugandan activist. She was saying, Vanessa Nakate, that she was saying that the focus is on people. Remember the people, we the people, really underscoring the fact that it is communities. It is the populations of the countries of the global south which are in the spotlight here. That was picked up by Mia Mottley, who is the Prime Minister of Barbados, and she really gave a firepower speech. She was saying that we cannot continue in the shadow of the old imperial order. There has to be change, and that cannot be change that comes in the future. That has to be rapid change that happens now, saying that the time for action is not in a couple of years or a couple of months. The time for action is today, and hopefully there would be agreed solutions tomorrow. This two-day summit, she really laid down the gauntlet to the world leaders, saying that they do want to see concrete results in terms of the plans to how to bring down poverty reduction, also bring down the challenges that we do face in terms of emissions, and increase the support for just energy transitions, the support for biodiversity, and the support for the fight against climate change. It
really is the ongoing tug of war globally, isn't it, Ross, where you've got African countries, and of course you mentioned the activist from Barbados, from Uganda, and then you've got Mia Mottley from the African diaspora. But really, I think the big tug of war right now being that Africa contributes only 4% to global warming, and that's the big argument, and yet a lot is being asked of Africa to really have that transition. So when you've got a summit this big that brings 300 world leaders together, how much representation does Africa really have? And maybe you can take us through the sort of argument they're then putting on the table about how they have that just energy transition while wanting to industrialize all at the same time.
There are lots of head of states from African countries here at the summit. There certainly is a good representation from across the continent, from Egypt in the north, right down to, of course, President Ramaphosa in the south. And he has already spoken to his Congolese counterpart, Denis Sassou Nguesso, from the Republic of Congo. The two men recently, in the last half hour, I've been told, have just had a quick bilateral. They took one another aside and spoke about the challenges in terms of green growth for both those countries. They're both focused on speaking with Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the Egyptian president, about specifically green growth and supporting the financing of the protection of biodiversity. South Africa is such a biodiverse country in terms of the flora, the fauna and the landscapes as well, and the Republic of Congo, such a deep forested nation. So there is a lot of discussion already underway. We have just heard the Abiy Ahmed from Ethiopia speaking. And so in terms of the African nations, Senegal is represented, Madagascar is represented, Tunisia, along with Nigeria. So there is a lot of discussion and a lot of focus on the points of view being put forward for green growth, debt, investment and loans from the African point of view, certainly.
Yeah, one of the biggest challenges, of course, has been even financing climate or transition on the African continent, and even issues around where African countries are able to mitigate against climate change. I mean, what are some of the calls that are being made by African countries? And the biggest issue has been the commitments that are being made then by the West in this discussion.
Yeah, the commitment by the West for financing a sustainable future. There is certainly a lot of discussion about natural disaster clauses, about debt restructuring, debt cancellation, or at least debt pausing when it comes to the Western countries and their financing of those objectives to try to improve liquidity, to try to improve the financing models and the structures that support developing nations in Latin America, the Caribbean, in Africa, and in Asia as well. And there is representation from all those regions at this two-day summit. It's hosted by Emmanuel Macron, but there are a lot of players, a lot of stakeholders from across the world, from international organizations. We heard Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, speak a little bit earlier. We've got the President of the World Bank, down to really small countries like Rwanda or like East Timor in Southeast Asia also being represented, those points of view from small Caribbean countries as well. So it is about that chance to put forward how urgent the need is to support education efforts and poverty reduction efforts, and don't de-link them from also efforts to support fighting climate change.
Yeah, well, we've been watching our president very closely here, and he's had quite a packed itinerary over the past week, certainly traveling various parts of Europe. Talk to us about what time we're expecting him to take to the podium, if we're able to figure that out at this point.
Yeah, so as I say, his movements are fluid, and in fact, the location for that, the bilateral he had with the President of the Republic of Congo, that changed location and timing at the last minute, as you can imagine, with hundreds of representation across the world, more than 30 heads of state. There's a great chance for presidents like Cyril Ramaphosa just to hold quick one-on-ones with all sorts of different leaders to try to put a point those points of view, not just bilateral between South Africa and the other country, but also that point of view between South Africa and whichever leader he's speaking to about the objectives for green infrastructure, about the objectives for a green growth. We do know that there is a scheduled one-on-one, though, with the host of the summit, Emmanuel Macron, and Cyril Ramaphosa, due to speak at around 2:15 South African and French time this afternoon.
All right, great stuff. Such a pleasure chatting to you, Ross, and thanks for keeping us updated. That's our correspondent, Cullen, there, speaking to us from Paris.